we're going to start by quickly also just a little introduction of who we are and who's presenting. My name is Dionisio Cortés Ortega. I'm one of the principals of Reform Architecture, along with Karim Ahmed, who's also on here. Reform Architecture is based in the Bronx, and we're a full-service architecture studio that specializes in residential renovations, new homes, historic restoration, and hospitality design. Both of us were trained at Cooper Union, which is, if you know the school, is very focused on sort of the poetics of space, thoughtfulness, and precision. And Michelle is, she can speak a little bit about ArtCondo.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Michelle Gambera, and I'm the founder of ArtCondo. And ArtCondo was formed to help New York City artists to stay in New York City and to own space. So we're basically a resource for New York City artists to help them buy, sometimes lease, so that they can own real estate and become rooted in their communities and gain equity. And so we're organizing some of these talks as educational, as a resource for, especially for creative people. Anyone can join.
Sounds good. And then I guess before we start also, just a little shout out. Michelle has another presentation in April. I don't know if Michelle, if you want to say a couple words about that before we start.
Yeah. So that's just an overview of ArtCondo and the conceptual foundations of it, where it's really coming from my art practice as an artist. And we're going to do like this little lunch and learn thing. So it's at noon and everybody's invited. I'll send out an invite. I have a monthly newsletter that I sent out, or every 2-3 months. So that's what this is. That is.
Great. Thank you. All right, well, let's get started. Renovating condos and co-ops in New York City. Let me start with a little sort of index of what we're going to look at tonight, very briefly. First, we're going to look at what a condo and co-op are and what their differences. Then we're going to look into zoning very, very quickly, because it's not really going to be that applicable to renovating condos and co-ops, but I think it's always good to know at least what it is and how it works. Then we'll do a little bit on the Landmark Preservation Commission, LPC, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. That might actually be applicable to and have an impact if you do own or plan to renovate a condo or co-op in a landmark building. Then we'll look quickly into the building code and how that affects what a renovation is in New York City. We'll look at a couple of examples, and then we'll look at the process and the requirements typically that are needed to undergo the renovation. We'll review all the material, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So let's get started. Condominiums and cooperatives. Now, I want to start with two very iconic examples, which I'm sure everybody knows. On the right, we have the Dakota, which is an example of one of the oldest cooperatives in New York City. I'm sure if you know about it, it's where John Lennon lived and unfortunately and sadly also got shot. But it's an old landmark, and it is one of the older cooperatives in New York City, beautiful cooperatives. On the left, you have 423 Park Avenue, which I'm sure if you've ever driven outside of the city is impossible to ignore, as it just stands as a pencil right in the middle of the city. Some people think it's beautiful just because of simplicity. Others hate it, but this is an example of a condominium. So this sort of will give you an idea of what to expect when you think about a condominium and when you think about a cooperative. And we'll look at those and those characteristics that sort of you see here will be reflected generally when you are out and looking at other spaces. So let's start with condominiums. So conceptually speaking, I like to think about these as sort of joined houses. And I'll explain to you a little bit what I mean. And I'll start by going down the list. So a condominium is a private residence in a multi-unit building. They're normally newer. They appeared in the 1970s. An very important aspect is that you physically own the apartment. You physically own the space, and you co-own all the shared spaces like elevators and hallways. and you have a deed, and that's sort of it's critical. You have a piece of paper that says that this is your property. Generally speaking, and this is sort of on a case-by-case basis, they're going to tend to be more expensive. However, they're going to be easier to finance, but they're also going to be a more liquid asset. Usually the application for purchasing is going to be a little bit simpler. And then two very important things to note is that you will have fewer renovation alteration regulations, but again, they're going to vary from building to building. And it's going to be very easy or much easier to rent or lease your space, since again, it's your physical property. Now let's look at cooperatives. The only thing that they share with condominiums is that they are also a private residence in a multi-unit building. As we saw with the example of the Dakota, they appeared in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and they are owned and managed by residents who own shares in a corporation who owns the title of the building. And so this results in a stock and lease type of ownership. So you do not own any physical space when you buy into a cooperative. And that's very important to understand, because conceptually, I missed the first part. Conceptually, think of this as sort of, you're going to be part of a community, right? There's one community in a building and you're sort of buying yourself into that. And because of that, it's going to be a lot harder to sell. So it's a much less liquid asset. They tend to be a little bit cheaper, but the application process is going to be a little more complicated. Two very defining characteristics are they're going to have a lot more regulations. Again, they vary from building to building. And also, as opposed to condominiums, they're going to be a little more difficult to rent out or lease. Again, because the buyer is going to be expected to live in the unit as their home. Again, with this idea of a community. And again, because you don't physically own the space, anything that you do inside your apartment is going to affect the value of the entire building. So that's why renovations end up being a little more difficult, a little more complicated, require more review than condominiums. Now let's do a very quick introduction to zoning. Zoning, in a few words, it's basically a legal instrument that the city has that regulates the use of the land, the building size, shape, height, and setbacks. It was originally implemented to sort of protect areas, make sure that neighborhoods are safe for residents, and that are sort of separated and from manufacturing districts or commercial districts. It's sort of if you're interested in learning more, this map, Zola, from New York City Zoning and Land Use, is a very useful tool. If you just Google Zola New York City Zoning, you will see it. If you do want to learn more, I recommend you check it out. It has everything that you need to know. This is not going to be really applicable to what we're discussing today, since it's, we're going to talk specifically about apartments, condominiums, and co-ops. But it's always good to know what zoning is and what it's for. Landmark Preservation Commission. This will have an impact on some units, more particularly on co-ops, since they are in older buildings. Very generally, Landmarks Preservation Commission is an organization that develops and enforces a set of rules that protects the architectural historic fabric of the city. It's usually divided, it's divided into three different sections. You have the Landmark Historic District, which are basically neighborhoods. They're sort of historical neighborhoods. You have Scenic Districts, which are usually allocated to parks and boulevards, and then individual landmarks. And we'll go through them very quickly now. So Landmark Historic District are usually areas in the city where if most, or if not all of the buildings within that neighborhood show or exhibit some sort of architectural historic significance. For example, here, the photo of Cobble Hill, all of the, for a couple of blocks, you will have brownstones with a lot of detailed architectural features. And these are going to be repeated throughout a couple of blocks. So the city decided to protect the whole neighborhood as a whole. Usually renovations that happen within the interiors are not going to really affect the exterior. Still need to go through landmarks, but it's usually, you usually only request a letter of no exception, meaning that you're not going to touch the exterior. But any new additions will have to go through a Landmark Preservation Commission. Then we have scenic districts, which are similar to the historic neighborhood, but these usually will be designated to parkways, boulevards, or parks. And again, similar to the historic district, any buildings that are within this area are going to have some historical significance or detailing, and will need to be protected and maintained. And then lastly, you have the individual landmarks. This one in particular sometimes will require the restoration of all of the facades. But again, this is not going to be relevant to co-ops and condominiums. But it's good to know that, in case you are going to be buying an apartment in the Dakota, it might be something that you will need to know. Rarely do interiors of buildings get landmarks, but there are a few rare cases. But they're going to be primarily designated to lobbies or shared spaces. Now, quick introduction to building codes. What are building codes? Generally speaking, they are sort of a set of rules that specify the standards for construction of any physical aspect of the city that is built, such as buildings, sidewalks, playgrounds, utilities. And the main purpose of these building codes are to ensure proper construction and ensure the public health and safety. They're not out there, the city didn't develop these to get you or to make life more complicated for your renovation. They really are to protect you, to make the city a safe place to live. So, keep that in mind. I know that it can be frustrating filing plans, but it is for the best and the safety of everybody. Now, before we talk about the type of work done with a permit, we'll talk about what kind of work you can do without one. And before I describe what that is, it is critically important, and as you see the big asterisks on that title, that I highly recommend you speak to your building management professional or contractor before you start any work. It's very hard to know what you're getting into, especially in the older buildings. So, even if you just plan to put up a painting and install a nail, you have no idea what's behind the wall. So the safest thing to do is always let your building management know. But that said, the Department of Buildings will allow you to do some work without a building permit. So let's go through what that is. They'll allow you to plaster and paint existing walls. There's a note, if you do plan on removing any of the paint, you need to make sure that there is no lead in it. That's sort of critical and super important in terms of safety. You're allowed to install cabinetry. You're allowed to refloor. Again, another important note is if you do plan on removing any flooring, if you're dealing with an old building, primarily with a plastic vinyl, some of the adhesives might contain asbestos. So that's something really important to also consider or inform the building. They will make you get some testing done. And then also you are allowed to remove a maximum amount of 45 square feet of wall without a building permit. But again, I'm going to emphasize many times, don't do any work without consulting a professional or your building board or a contractor. Apart from that, you are allowed to do some limited alterations that are related to plumbing, mechanical, sprinkler, and equipment. The work will technically be done through a permit, but it is a permit that a master skilled tradesperson can get. For example, a plumber, right? If you just plan on either moving or enlarging your kitchen, and you're only going to do some plumbing work, that plumber, if they're licensed, they will be able to get what's called a limited alteration application and get a permit to do that work without an architect. So those are the things that you can do without having to deal with the Department of Buildings. But more generally, the type of work that will usually end up happening for a co-op or a condominium renovation is going to be an alteration type 2. Alteration type 1, I won't get too much into it. That usually is for more complicated renovations that change the type, the use, the egress, or the occupancy of the space, which won't be applicable to this case. And alteration types 3 are also not very common. They're sort of smaller renovations that involve one trade and are temporary construction. The main focus for our scenario is going to be the alteration type 2, which are the most common. They involve more than one trade that do not change the use, egress, or occupancy. So before we get into the types, what makes a renovation of a condo or co-op unique? And if you can read upside down, or if you can guess by the picture, it's going to be your neighbors. This is sort of the critical thing to understand, and also the building board, of course. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So common types of alterations. We'll start by looking at what an alteration agreement is. This is going to be one of the more important documents that you'll want to get your hand on before you even start your project. But then we're going to look at combining, separating apartments. We're going to look at removing or relocating walls, renovating bathrooms and or kitchens, new windows, flooring, lighting, and then replacing or adding new heating, cooling, and mechanical systems. So let's talk about alteration agreement. So the alteration agreement is a document normally provided by the building management that outlines the rules, regulations, and requirements regarding any type of alteration. Normally, the type of requirements will be certificate of insurance from contractors, license requirements from contractors and or architects or consultants, time that you're allowed to work in the building, equipment that's not allowed to be used, fees or security deposits, and sometimes the building will have specific details that they require for the type of work that you're planning to do. So, all of these things are important for you to know, and important also for the architect, if you happen to hire one, to know as well. And so before you even start your project, or maybe even sometimes before you even buy an apartment, ask the building for an example of their alteration agreement. So let's look at combining and separating apartments. I'll go through this list. Normally, if you're going to combine 2 apartments, you are legally only allowed 1 kitchen. Normally, what people do with the second kitchen is they reuse the plumbing and they turn it into a bathroom. So that's something that can be done. You can combine up to 2 floors vertically, or 2 adjacent floors. You can also, and it's important that the egress remains unchanged. You can't change the location of the apartment door. So that's something that has to remain unchanged. If you're going to be combining a condominium, you will have to file that. You have to file the drawings with the Department of Finance for a new tax law prior to filing with DOB. So consult with the tax attorney before you begin that process. That's an important one. And separating apartments is generally limited to apartments that have been previously joined. So it's going to be rare separating units. Normally, again, because you can't change the egress, so it's usually done. Usually, separating apartments is for units that have been joined previously. Moving and removing walls. As I mentioned before, the Department of Building will allow a maximum of 45 square feet to be removed without a permit. Again, don't remove any walls without consulting the building board or professional. But things to consider, if you do want to move your wall is, figure out why it's there, or what it's for, or what's in it, right? Research. That's going to be incredibly important for you to know if you do plan or want to move a wall. That can be done by a contractor conducting probes from the direction of the architect engineer. Probes are basically little holes where you can look into and see what's inside. Also understanding the possible trades. If you through a probe you find that there's plumbing or electrical or mechanical, it's important to know that if you do still want to move that wall, you're going to need to involve a lot more trades. It's also important to consider that if you live in a building where a lot of the units are somewhat repetitive, if you know one of your neighbors has done a renovation in the past, they will be familiar with the location of flues or utilities, and they will help you understand the existing conditions. And same for the superintendent. Sometimes superintendents have been there for years and they know everything about that building. So, use their knowledge. It's important that they will inform you of everything about your apartment if they've been there for a long time. Renovating bathroom or kitchens. This is sort of this is going to be one of the more common types of renovations, and it's critical again that you check the alteration agreement. I've seen some alteration agreements where if you open up any part of the wall or any cabinetry that exposes the plumbing branches, they have a clause there that requires them to replace all of that. So, this is important because if you're not planning on this, this could break the budget. So knowing ahead of time that this is going to be a requirement, a building requirement, is critically important. And same for the waterproofing. Depending on the building management, if you do any work in the kitchen or if you're planning on redoing floors, they might require you to waterproof the entire room. Something that you might have not planned for before. So it is critical you check the alteration agreement. Other things to consider for your renovation is, do you want to do custom or prefab cabinets? That obviously will have an effect on your budget. Prefab are usually less expensive, but if you're working within constrained and existing conditions, it might be a little hard to get everything to fit perfectly. So those are things to think about. Other things are, it's important that to check the specifications of the plumbing fixtures. If you live on the upper floors, there might be water pressure issues that you might take into consideration. So it's good to know that and speak to the super about that as well. Same for electrical loads. If you are planning on adding high consuming appliances like induction ranges, it's also important to know if there is enough capacity in your electrical panel for things like that. And I think it goes without saying that because a lot of these buildings, all of the flues and the utility lines are strategically located within the whole building, it's going to be difficult to relocate a bathroom or a kitchen. New windows, floors, and lighting. For windows, I'll just very quickly go through these. Things to consider are the Energy Conservation Code of New York. There will be a certain requirement for window panes. Also, if they are landmark, it's something to understand that they will be reviewed by Landmark Preservation Commission to make sure that they maintain the certain qualities of the neighborhood. And also, it's good to know that if the building allows, you are allowed to vent through some existing windows if you plan on installing a washer dryer. Floors and ceilings, some of the more important things to consider is noise. As we've talked about previously, you have neighbors everywhere. And this is sort of not only during construction, but throughout the rest of your stay there, making sure that you reach the code requirements for the IIC, the impact isolation class, and the sound transmission class are critically important because you do not want upset neighbors. Again, as we talked about, if you're going to redo floors, you should check to see if it will contain asbestos. And also making sure that with the alteration agreement, if you're going to be required to provide any waterproofing. And then for lighting, similar with the windows, they must follow the energy conservation code. There are some exceptions if you live in landmark buildings, but that's on a case-to-case basis. And as we also talked about previously, you got to check your electrical loads. If you plan to add a lot or special types of lighting, and also check the age of the conduits. If you are going to be moving into an old building and that unit hasn't been renovated in 50 years, and you find conduits with paper wrapping, that's a sign you're going to have to redo your whole electrical. So make sure you know all of these things, or consider, at least think about all these things before you go into you start your renovation. And then lastly, mechanical systems. This is also a pretty common type of addition for certain units without air conditioning. Things to consider are the location. If you don't have a terrace, will the building let you put it on the roof? Are there other units with similar type of systems that you are wanting to install? If not, will you need a dunnage or the roof structure? Will you need to build it on top of a new roof curb? And if you will it affect roofing? You should check with the building if how old the roofing is. If you need to penetrate it, that could cause problems or void warranties. So before you start any of that work, it's important to know what type of conditions exist for you to install the new mechanical system. Normally, anything under 3 tons you don't require a permit from the building department. But again, that also depends on a case-by-case basis. If you do live in a landmark building, landmark has to approve it, and so that will trigger a DOB filing. So these are important things to understand. And also, if you're going to be installing it on the outside, you might need to engage some engineers for special inspections if you're going to be penetrating walls that are fire rated. And again, if some of the older roofs might have asbestos, so if you are going to be disturbing the roofs with a new roof curb, it's important to understand that as well. Now let's look at sort of the process of what an alteration you need to go through with an alteration. So the first thing I would recommend, as I've mentioned many times, is obtain an alteration agreement. This will be your guiding, document for your process, because as we mentioned before, it will many times impact the scope of work of your project. So that leads me to the next item, which is determine the scope of your work. If you want a new kitchen and a new bathroom, make sure you understand what that entails and what requirements you're going to be needing from the building management. And then I highly suggest you reach out to a professional. And I know this is sort of going to be, I always hear this question, should I hire an architect? And we've been asked that many, many times. I think we should do a presentation about that later. But in reality, honestly, even if you don't end up hiring an architect or a professional or an engineer, I still recommend you at least reach out. Even a quick phone call will help you understand, talk to someone about what you're planning, what you want to do. They will have some insights or some suggestions. Obviously, don't abuse them without paying them, but they are, don't be scared to reach out. There are architects out there that will help you and make the whole process a lot easier. And that's sort of, apart from them providing you a stamp and a seal and approval for the building department, they're out there to help you with your project and make the whole thing easy. So something important is, always consider reaching out to a professional. For the sake of this chart, let's say you do end up getting a professional. They will then prepare drawings and specifications. Normally that takes around 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the size of the project. Those drawings and those documents will then need to be reviewed by the building board and the building engineer. Normally a process, again, that takes around 2 to 4 weeks. During that time, though, you can start reaching out to contractors and start compiling bids for your project. Once you have building board and engineer approval, then that will get sent to be reviewed by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, if applicable, in case you do live in a historic building. Normally, this process takes a little bit longer, around 3 to 6 weeks. Also, depending if you don't plan on doing any exterior work, it's normally a little faster process. If you do plan on doing some exterior work that needs to be reviewed, it's going to be a little bit longer. Once you have approval for that, then it goes to the building departments. And that process also takes around 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the size and the complexity of the project, of course. And then during this time, the architect or engineer, whoever professional you've hired, will prepare the construction documents that will be given to the contractor for final bid and then for construction. The construction, again, it's hard to estimate depending on the size of your project, could take 2 to 6 months. But it's important to note that some building management will have a limit to the amount of time they allow for renovation. So that's something to keep in mind, and or let the contractor and architect know. And then if all goes well, then you finish after the building gets inspected and the project gets inspected and the architect does his final walkthrough and sign off. And now a few typical items that are required by the building board are listed below, and these could be things like the signed alteration agreement, drawings, specifications, which are usually the cut sheets and information about specifics of materials and or plumbing fixtures or lighting fixtures, the electrical load letter, the certificate of insurance, an indemnification agreement, contractor licenses. If you do plan on doing your project soon, while we're still under the COVID restrictions, some of them will require you affirm to their guidelines. And then if you are filing with the city, the building management will also require all the DOB filing forms. And there will be fees. And obviously, this is just an example. There's a lot more stuff that they might require. So let's do a quick review. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. So co-op, condo and co-op, important things to understand about them is that there is a building management that you need to contact and form a relationship with. Make sure you are friendly with your neighbors and your super. I know, we're all New Yorkers and we hate everything and everybody, but when you're going to do a renovation, be super friendly and make the cookies for your neighbors. Honestly, it could save you huge headaches. They're going to be your best friends during this process, your neighbors and the super. Also learn from your neighbors and the super. They will give you incredibly valuable information because sometimes they've gone through it or the super's been there for many years. And then understand, the difference between the condo and co-op. If you are planning to buy, make sure what each of those, what the difference is and what really is what works for you. If it's your home or if it's something you plan on renting out. Codes, again, they exist not to get you or make your life more difficult. Quite the opposite, in fact, they're there to protect you. Sure, they might complicate the process a little bit, but at the end of the day, they're important and they exist for a reason. Landmark Preservation Commission, they protect historic fabric of the architecture. It's good to know if the apartment that you're in is in a landmark building or not, because it will add a little bit of additional cost and or time to the project. So it's always good to know that. For renovations, again, check your alteration agreement. That's going to be one of the most important documents for your renovation. Consult with a professional if, again, I always suggest that you do it, even if it's just a quick chat, and there could be a lot of insightful information, even if you're just putting up cabinets. It's important to understand the process and the requirements. Again, most of the requirements are going to be under the alteration agreement, but they will vary from building to building. And know your budget. Understand that we live in New York City, and New York City logistics are very complicated. When you think that, oh, okay, I'm just going to put up some cabinets, how complicated can that be? But we sometimes forget that the contractor, the painter, whoever's going to be doing the work needs to find parking. They might get tickets. They need to unload stuff. They need to check with the building management which elevator they're going to use. Will the things that you want fit in the elevator? Like, there's just so many unknowns, and in the city that we don't normally think about, that a contractor does have to think about, where suddenly you're imagining that how could the cabinets cost more than $1,000 to put up. It's because it takes a long time and a very complex process to get the people to do that work. So that's sort of important to know as well. And then in general, be thorough as possible, and get informed. The more you know, the simpler the process is going to be, and the easier it's going to get. Be prepared and be honest. I think that's sort of I'll end with that, because that's sort of one of the most important qualities you can, or one of the important things that you can be while you're doing this very large and expensive project, is you figure out what you want, figure out what you need, figure out what your budget is, and make sure everybody knows. It's critical to be able to be transparent with the people that you work, because they're all going to be on your team, and everyone's there to help each other. So with that, I'll end the presentation. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I'll give everybody a little bit of time to submit any questions or comments or anything they want to talk about. Remind everybody of Michelle's Lunch and Learn on April 15th. Yeah, let's get to the questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tia. I'm going to jump right into it. We got one question fairly early on, or a few questions from Ellen. I think you addressed most of them, but there's two that I think we didn't really address. The first is enclosing balconies. And there's a sub question to that, which is, can you do a temporary structure in lieu of a permanent one? I think I remember we had a project with people doing that. And then the second was, do buildings.
Sorry, say that again, Kareem. There was a little noise.
Oh, sorry. The first question is about whether you can contain a private section of an outdoor space, such as a balcony or a roof or outdoor space. Can you enclose it? And if so, can you enclose it temporarily or permanently? I was mentioning we had that project in Brooklyn that you can speak to a pretty good example about that. And then the second is, do buildings give permission to add skylights on top floors?
Okay, skylights. So to answer the first question, that it is possible, but the important thing to understand is, and also this might be different for a condominium or a cooperative. If you want to do that, one, you need to get permission from the building management, and two, you have to let the building department know. That kind of renovation will trigger an alteration type 2, because you are adding square feet of interior space. If you have a condominium, that might actually affect your taxes, So in many cases, like the one that Kareem was talking about, people will not get permits. They will not let the building board know, and they will just do it on their own. And that can be very dangerous and could result in fees. So I think if you would like to do that, that is something that you should definitely reach out to a professional about, because it does have a lot of it will affect the size and the safety, and the building board will, the building department will want to know about that. As for temporary, I guess I don't know if you're going to go through the trouble of enclosing it. I guess I maybe don't understand why you'd want to make it temporary. If you make, Kareem, if you have any ideas about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only, I think a temporary balcony would be weird, and we had an experience where some owners in a building did very unsafe temporary constructions on their balconies that we actually, in the course of, this is a sort of separate issue, but for certain buildings that are taller, such as buildings that are 6 stories or taller, qualify for local law 11. And the experience that we had was that the owners of the condo units built temporary structures on their balconies, and in order to pass the local law 11, they had to demolish all of them, remove all the storage that they were putting. A lot of them were using it for like kind of storage, like seasonal storage. So all of them, in order to pass the local law 11, they had to demolish all of them anyway. These were all things that were not filed in the first place, so they weren't legally there. And also the temporary constructions, because they were unfiled and they weren't really done by a contractor, they were done in a way that led to a lot of water damage throughout the entire building. And so they sort of sabotaged themselves there by not doing things formally and speaking to a design professional and filing with the DOB. The thing I would say about the temporary structures, the only thing that I can think about, the question mentioned a roof. You know, maybe if you wanted to do a roof event, like you had a very large roof and you wanted to use the whole roof for some type of event, your building may allow that. That would absolutely need to be filed with the building department, primarily because there are fire concerns. And actually there's laws about how many people you can have on a roof to begin with. So if you file any type of structure on a roof, whether it's, you can have like a sort of cabana unit or fencing around the roof, there's actually very strict fire codes about what you can put on a roof, even if it's just temporary. So that absolutely has to be filed. And then the other part of that question here was for skylights on roof.
Oh yeah. Just one more thing about the balconies. One more thing about the balconies. They also, that could be kind of a complicated process because they were originally designed structurally as places for a certain amount of weight. So if you want to change that into interior, then that kind of, there needs to be some sort of structural, we haven't personally yet done a project like that, so we're not 100% sure, but I can imagine that it will require structural review, and it could be a long, complicated process, just because they weren't initially designed to be interior spaces. So just to clarify that. For skylights, I think that is definitely a possibility. That will have to be filed because it might affect some of the structure of the roof. And it's important, again, like I mentioned with some of the mechanical equipment, if you do plan to put it on the roof, because a skylight is a penetration, it will affect the roofing. And so it's important to know the age of the roof, if it still has a warranty, because penetrating it might void it. And if suddenly there's leaks because of your skylight, that could cause a lot of problems. So, sometimes the same roofers, if you speak to whoever installed the roofing, you might be able to work with them to do part of the flashing required to install the skylight. So it is a complicated process, but it's again, it depends on the building if they will allow it or not. But it's something that can absolutely be done.
Okay. Next question. If someone wants to do the work themselves, They think they're handy, they know how they work, they wear on some tools. Is that okay? How would you deal with Department of Buildings and the building board in that situation?
So I think I briefly mentioned this. If you're a handyman, that's great. I still think, and if it's, for example, if you're just doing some cabinetry work or painting walls, I still think highly recommend and insist that you let the building know your plans. I think it's important to first reach out to them because they also, even if you're just planning on painting your walls and replacing your sink, even if it's something really minor, the rules that the building management has established might require you to get a building permit, regardless of the size of your project. This could be for a number of reasons, because of liability, because of the process, whatever. So in some cases, even if you are super handyman, the building might still require it. If they don't, I would still let them know what you're planning. Speak to the super. He might even give you a hand, if you're friendly with them. And also he might know or give you advice on like, oh no, don't do that wall because that wall's full of plumbing. Like, it's always important to talk to the people, especially, going back to the reasons why co-op and condominium renovations are unique, is because you are living in shared spaces. You're going to have neighbors everywhere. You're going to share all of the utilities, and you're going to be making noise for everybody. So even if you think you can put the cabinets by yourself, and you start making, you bring in a huge table saw and start cutting stuff, your neighbors are not going to like that. And someone might call 311 and you're going to have someone knocking at your door and telling you, what are you doing? Even if you don't require a permit, that can still happen. So, it's let the building know, you are now part of the building, you're either, whether it's a condominium or a co-op and there are people around you, let people know what you're planning. That's what I would suggest. It can't hurt to let the building know what you're going to do. And they might even help you. So, it's possible. If you're a handyman, go for it, do it yourself. Make sure that you don't require a permit, but definitely speak to your building about it.
I would add one more thing to that deal, which is that a very common concern that buildings have are their freight elevators. Mm-hmm. So especially older buildings will have one elevator for passengers and one for freight. And if you ever have, sometimes depending on the building, if you have a large package or even moving, like if you want to move a couch in, you'll have to schedule the use of that freight elevator. And that will be the case even if you're bringing paint up. So you might think it's just painting or bringing up some cabinets, but you might have ordered those cabinets for Tuesday, and turns out another general contractor in the building reserved the elevator that day, and you're not allowed to bring up any freight. And now you're sitting with cabinets outside on the curb. So it's always good to communicate, especially with the super and building management.
That's a good point.
We have next question. Is asbestos removal and asbestos testing typically the responsibility of the co-op condo building, or is it typically the responsibility of the share owner or resident of the condo unit?
It's typically the responsibility of the shareholder or owner of the unit. And it's something that is very serious, that the city takes very seriously, and I'm sure all the building management and building boards also take seriously. And if it does require, if there is asbestos and it requires removal, you will need to hire experts. There are licensed asbestos removal companies that are the only people that are allowed to do that. So yeah, that's a good question. It's important to know that you will be responsible for taking care of that asbestos, unless it's not in your space and it's something, I don't know, in the roof or a shared space. That's a conversation you're going to have with the building management.
And I would add to that, For outdoor spaces, especially terraces and roof decks, sometimes you have to really look at your condo book and your agreement of what are common spaces or what are limited common spaces to find out exactly who and what the boundaries of those spaces, those outdoor spaces are. That's a common thing where sometimes the boundaries are a little fuzzy, and it definitely bears some research, especially if you're about to purchase a unit.
Yeah.
The next question is, does the Department of Buildings differentiate with condo and co-op units compared to each other with approvals or fees or ease of process?
Not that I can think of. My only thoughts are regarding the needing to reach out to the Department of Finance if you plan on any changes in a condominium that have to do with area. But whether the Department of Building cares or not, if it's a condo or a co-op. Can you think of anything, Kareem? I can't.
I can't really think of any examples. I think it's probably going to be pretty similar, with the exception of changing area of units.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference is not going to be with the Department of Buildings, but it's going to be with your community. I think that's what's going to be very different is the review process with a cooperative is going to be a little more complicated. As I explained, because everybody owns a little bit of the building.
Yeah, I would add.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I would add to that even with a condominium building, in my experience, the condominium board in my experience takes longer to approve a set of plans than the Department of Buildings does.
Yeah.
So usually you might think, oh, the Department of Buildings are really gonna hold me up. Usually it's gonna be your building board that's actually, and the building boards typically have their own architect and or engineer who reviews any project that goes on in the building. And so when you have that, they typically take longer to turn around and give their own objections compared to the Department of Building. So that's something to keep in mind as far as time.
Yeah.
Next question we have coming up is, do you have any experience adding soundproofing to a ceiling? Will it add any value? Does it work?
So it definitely does work. There is a big difference between, if what's interesting about ceiling, acoustical ceiling protection is that it's within your own space. Normally, you would want all of your neighbors kind of have to, in a kind of puzzled way, everybody needs to kind of be conscious of each other. So if I live on apartment C, I'm going to want to install soundproofing on my floors so that the person below me doesn't have any issues. Especially because at one point on that floor slab is where the dividing space is for the properties. And it's sort of kind of a general courtesy that everybody should take into consideration. Because if then, your neighbor upstairs doesn't, because they want to save the 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch of sound insulation, suddenly you're finding yourself adding 2-3 inches on your ceiling because they didn't add it. So it's kind of a tricky thing where, yes, it absolutely works. If your neighbors are really loud and put up some insulation, it will help. If you suddenly find out that they're doing a renovation, run upstairs, bring them a platter of cookies and plead them to, put more sound insulation. And it's also good to remember that by code, there is at least a minimum that needs to be added when you're doing a renovation. I think it's around like 50 units.
yeah.
I forget exactly
Yeah,
what.
50 STC and 50 ISC.
Yeah, that will help a lot, but yeah, it's, make sure you, again, communicate with your neighbors and form a healthy relationship so that they protect you from their noise, you protect your neighbor downstairs from your noise, etc.
Okay, well, that's the last question we have so far. I just sent another query if anyone else wants to send any more.
All right. I mean, and if anybody has any specific questions about any projects that you're thinking about doing, please feel free to reach out to us. We can be those nice professionals that gives you hints and and tips, even if you don't hire us. We hope you do, but we'd be happy to at least have that conversation with you guys. Yeah, so please reach out. Let us know also what you thought of the presentation. That's always helpful. Yeah, I don't know, Michelle, do you want to say anything else?
No, I thought it was great. Thank you. Appreciate
Great.
it. And yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, for organizing this. Thank you to ArtCondo as well. Keep stay in touch, because we do more presentations in the future. We also have done a few others. Kareem Ahmed, my business partner, has done a few presentations on townhouse renovations and live work. We're hoping to get those up on YouTube or some on our website soon. So we'll let everybody know. There's definitely a lot of useful information there.
And do you want to just leave that that screen with that email up, just in case anyone wants to copy that down to send any more personal questions?
Yeah, I'll leave this up. Yeah, but no, thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you for your questions, and yeah, and good luck with your renovation.
Sounds good. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle, for hosting, and Dionisio for presenting, and Kareem for supporting. I can't recommend these people enough. They're astonishing. So,
Thank you, Eve.
Okay, good night, everyone.